This conference will now be recorded.
That's perfect, nice and clear, yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so like the introduction said, my name is Molly Evans. I am the designated project engineer on the Bristol East Junction remodelling project, and sitting next to me is Ben Zuliani, who's the project engineer track. So bit of a background about what we're going to talk today. It's the scope of Bristol East Junction, how we stage the project, the contracting mechanism, the breakdown of enabling stages and core works, and then the stage F, which was the big blockade that we had, construction strategy. Some of the engineering challenges, lessons learnt, and some of the achievements we've done so far. So Bristol East Junction, if for those of you that don't know, is the main junction that comes into Bristol Templemead Station, which sits in the city centre of Bristol. You've got the top 4 lines that connect to Filton and Bristol Parkway, and then you've got 2 lines from Bath Spa that come in, and this is the new layout that compromises of 50 S&C units, and what we did was ripped out the whole junction, which was existing 58. So the junction was rationalised to allow for the future timetable up to 2043. So how was the breakdown of the GRIP 5 to 8? So Network Rail acted as the hub, and I was delegated the kind of principal designer duties, bringing together all the different contract interfaces. So we had SRSA, which is South Rail Systems Alliance, who delivered the track elements and were the principal contractor, and that's a combination of COLAS as principal contractor and then ACOM as designer. You had the signalling that was done via Alstom. The civils elements were delivered by Amco Giffen. And then you had a number of smaller contracts, so resonated the control systems. We had SSE that did some 11 kV cable diversions, and Telent that did a number of different third-party cable diversions. And then we did the in-house driver training through our BIM team, and then Pennant did the training material, and NRDD did the signalling design. And then there were some other interfaces with some big enhancement schemes within the Bristol footprint. So there was the Templemead's roof that was being done at the same time. And we also had the Eastern Entrance, which is a civil scheme that goes into Platform 15, which I'll talk about later. So project scope for Bristol East Junction, like I mentioned, a recovery of 58 S&C units to replace with 50 new units with a number of plain-line installation as well. We also remodeled Kingston Road sidings. We put in a new signal structure and a 7-line gantry that went in, including a number of additional straight posts and a cantilever. We did a signalling data change to align to the new configuration of the layout. We also had telecoms upgrades, EMP diversions, and a lot of enabling stages of cable diversions as well. So the benefit of the job was to meet the passenger demand up to 2043 and allow for passive provision for a number of different other enhancement schemes that are going to come after this, including Metro West and Bristol West, which is what we're going on to next. But also there was real benefit in reducing the number of S&C units to help with our maintenance colleagues doing less inspections, and the junction was life expired. So everything kind of needed to come out for us to relay the new enhanced layout. So this is the existing versus the new. You can see there's an additional line that we've put in, and really it gives the flexibility for the station to be used with fast services going into some platforms, and then the slower services stopping in the platforms and then turning back and going off to London. So the job was broken down into a number of enabling stages. Stages A to E were predominantly stages which were either track or civils that meant that we tried to install as much plain line as possible without the need for doing a data change or changing any of the signalling. And then in stage F, which was the main stage, it was an 8-week blockade this year from the the 10th of July to the 4th of September, where the remaining scope in red that you can see on that diagram was installed. So I'm just going to kind of run through some of the enabling stages, and you should be able to see some of the works that are already done. So we're coming up on the lines from Bath, and we've already done the plain line renewals on the main lines. You can see we started to store panels in Kingsland Road sidings that has also been renewed as part of the enabling stage. And to the right, you can see we've done plain line renewals on the 4 tracks that are already coming into the station area. The offices that you can see just to the top left of your screen now, these are where we were basically based out of for the 8 weeks of the blockade. And at Christmas, we installed all of this S&C and ironwork in preparation for the 8-week blockade. As we come up at the top of your screen, you are about to see where the old existing infrastructure is with the dirty ballast. And this is pretty much where the renewal started in the summer. What we did also at Christmas was install the new gantry over the existing one. So the existing one sits underneath it, and that was removed in the blockade. And you can see we've already started constructing the 7th line, where basically a number of different panels were placed in preparation for the 8-week blockade. So this is the old layout now that the trains are running on. You can see there's a number of cables running down the side of where that yellow walking route was, which was a new walking route that was put in. And then we're starting to get into the tight curvature of the station, which was a constraint, to say the least. And as part of the enabling stages, we did do works in platform 13. So you can see just to the left of that IET, or right to the IET train, is the platform renewal that we did through platform 13. And here is the open area where the Eastern Entrance project was going to reconnect in under the tracks, and this will form part of a new station entrance into the future. On top of what we needed to do for Bristol East Depot, there was a complication late in the day where our layout was taking out the entrance and exit to an Arriva Train Care depot that's on the Bristol East Junction footprint. There was an agreement previously that Arriva Train Care would go and service their trains in GWR's depot that's just down the way. GWR pulled out probably 12 months before the blockade, saying that they didn't have the capacity to allow Arriva to get their trains serviced in that area. So what we had to do was build a temporary depot, which was a couple of miles away from the junction. This was done very quickly and at short notice, and so we built a depot that was allowing 6 trains to be serviced and cleaned each night. And what we managed to do was take out some of the track that was installed on the enabling stages and use that so that we could build the depot down the way. So we reused a lot of materials. We also had additional platform works that we needed to do in the Bedminster area for allowing services to stop in Bedminster and turn back around before they hit the junction during the blockade. So we did some temporary platform extensions at Bedminster for platform 1, 2 and 3. And then over to Ben.
Yeah, thanks Molly. So moving on to the blockade and going into a bit more detail. So stage F, partial blockade as it was known. So it was delivered during the summer, as Molly mentioned. So in terms of the scope or core scope that SRSA delivered, which was a combination of civils, track and E&P works. So in the station, due to the tight curvature, we had to do approximately maximum of 100 meters of platform coper adjustments, and this varied down to about 25 meters. We also had to remodel platform 15 and had to rebuild part of that platform due to the amount of slew away from the platform, and then also had to do a number of walkways and ramp rebuilding. In terms of track, we installed 34 S&C point ends during the blockade, of which majority of them were HPSS POE and the associated plane line. And then also from a track perspective, we also had to install lubrication, lerps due to the type curvature, but also all the separators and geotextiles that were required for the formation. And also the whole layout was welded and stressed during the blockade. And then also all the associated E&P work, so installation of DNOs, PHCCs, transformers, and all the points heating strips. In terms of the blockade timeline, it was split into a number of entry into service points. And this was because during the blockade, the aim was to keep as much of Bristol Temple Meads operational, which is why it was known as a partial blockade. So a lot of the work was undertaken with adjacent line open working, apart from only 11 days, which was when the whole junction was blocked. And basically the EIS points were broken down into 6 parts due to the various changes needing acceptance for operational use. So ES1 enabled basically the Filtons to be blocked and keep the bottom main lines operational. And then ES2, 3 and 4 were used as points for data change to enable ES5, which was when basically the junction was flipped. So the Filtons, which we had been working on, was commissioned and made operational, and we began work on the main lines. And then eventually ES6 was when the whole junction was commissioned. So I'll go into a bit more detail on that. As well as the entry into service points, we also split the track works down into parts. There was 4 parts, and they sort of aligned with the entry into service points. So part 1, as you can see by the diagram in the light blue, we undertook work on the top 4 lines, the filter lines. And this part took 28 days. So that included full scrap out and install of all the related track works. And then Alstom also undertook all their disconnections and installations of relevant signalling works, while AMCO undertook a number of walking routes to the north part of the junction. And during this whole time, the 2 bottom lines, which were in black, were operational. So we still had services running from London into platforms 15, 13, 11 and 9. On to part 2. So part 2, due to the amount of works that were taking place in this part, it was split into 3 different parts. So part 2A was 1 day, and this basically enabled the removal of the existing gantry, as was shown on the video, and also enabled Alstom to do some preparation works for the data change. Part 2B was the TS11 data change, and enabled work to begin on installing new cages and signals on the new gantry. And part 2C was the longer part, 7 days, which basically enabled the track work to remove the sort of central lines. It was the downfilter main, which sort of connected the top and lower part of the junction. And then also at the end of this stage, it was enabled ES5, which was where we commissioned the filter lines. In terms of part 4, at the end of part 3, we also delivered the main lines, and part 4 was commissioning of the entire junction. So in terms of CDM arrangements, it was generally quite straightforward for the majority of the junction, as SRSA were the PC, but in the station it was a lot more difficult. So there had to be specific deconfliction required between the different projects. So Bristol Junction remodelling, the roof renewal, and Eastern Entrance. So there was a CDM plan, integration plan that was signed up to all parties, and there was detailed demarcation barriers and hoarding plans, which identified where our work sites would be, but also because the station was operational for a large majority of the blockade, it also identified where we'd separate the operational part of the platforms to our work sites. So this is a quick time lapse of the works. So this is currently the cameras on the new gantry facing towards Bristol Templemead Station. And at the moment, part 1 works are currently being undertaken, so scrap out and install of new tracks already happened, as you can see. And as you can see, the panels have already been set up on the side of the track in preparation to help with the logistics. In terms of part 2, which will start to take place in a minute, the camera is going to shift. You'll see the existing gantry be removed and the exclusion zone. And you can also see the main lines are currently operational on the left-hand side of the screen. There we go, so it's flipped over now, and part 2 is currently taking place. So the gantry has just been removed by Kirovs. The downfill main's been scrapped out and being installed. And at this point, it's a full line block, and they're preparing for entering into service the Filtons. And then now part 3's began, and you'll see on the right side of the screen that the Filtons are now operational. And we're completing works to the mains. So yeah, it's just a quick time lapse just to show the progress and how the staging of the job worked and how it sort of interfaced with the operational railway.
Okay, so some high-level facts. We are very proud that we had no lost time injuries on the project. So that's our biggest stat, no safety incidents at all, with over 170,000 site hours worked. We had 21,000 tonnes of ballast installed, 238 track panels. We had 48 stressing pools, 74 Kirov shifts. So this just gives the kind of sort of stats of how the blockade was broken down and some of the key figures that we managed to achieve. But for us, yeah, the 0 lost time incidents was the main stat that we wanted to get. So I'm just going to do a run through of the station area itself now that everything's been installed. So now we're coming from Bristol Templemead, going the opposite direction out of the junction. You can see that we have got all of the lerps installed. There's a walking route that's in between platform 5 and 7. And all of the coper adjustments in the station have been installed. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see a new cantilever that's gone in. We had the new line installed to the right, and as you can see, the yellow walking route has been reinstated, so that allowed for all of the drivers to make their way up to the depot. We installed new troughing to all of our assets, and we were lucky enough to sign off the AMP 15 and 16 for track, civils work and E&P within the blockade, so there was no snags, and this meant that we've handed it back to the maintainer within a month of actually finishing the blockade. As we come up to the new gantry, you can see the new gantry now has got its signals on and backboards, and there's the new head shunt line that's been installed with the new friction buffer stop. All of the gantry had passive provision for OLE. That's why it's a massive structure with a walkable cage that you can go up and inspect all the signals in. As we come over the gantry, you'll see there's a new suite of lokes that have gone in. There is also to the left a viewing platform that was used for any VIPs, so nobody was allowed on site. There's a new walking route, which is walkable trough, that goes down the side to the left, which you can see a chap walking down now. That gets us access into Barton Hill Depot. And then the new layout ties into the enabling stages that were already installed prior to the blockade. So now we've connected everything together. There are new walking routes within the Barton Hill Depot area itself. And there was a ladder on the 4 tracks that go up towards Filton, which is where the camera will go now. That ladder was installed really early, but without the switches. So we plain lined all the switches. So during the blockade, we put the switch panels in and the HBSS units, and now these are fully operational itself. And the camera will follow its way around up to the bridge, which is basically where the renewal finished, and tied into the Filton 4 tracking enhancement scheme that was delivered a couple of years before. So onto sort of engineering challenges and some lessons learned. There are a number of things, but I've picked up some of the key learning points that we've had. So Modular Plus.
Yeah, so a challenge to the project was installing 36 point ends within the space of Blockade, and at the time, modular was, the modular sort of construction technique for S&C was not preferred by the RAM due to issues with gauge spread. So at times splice plates can fail or break apart and causing them the rail to spread and leading to potential derailment issues. So full modular was not preferred with the RAM. From a loose lay perspective, we just didn't have time to set out the whole junction with that technique. So we agreed to use a Modular Plus solution. So anywhere a standard 6 foot was between and a crossover, we could use modular, but anything non-standard or turnouts, we had to use Modular Plus. So basically, Modular Plus is using through bearers at strategic locations within the S&C unit. So as you can see by the unit on the screen, you've got through bearers under the crossing nose, and then a couple towards the switch, and then a couple towards the rear of the unit. Basically, it just provided extra support throughout the unit, reducing the risk of potential gauge spread issues. Depending on the type of unit as well, we'd either increase or reduce the amount of through bearers through the unit. So if there was more potentially just sort of differential traffic running between through the either through route and turnout route, we'd add extra through bearers. If they were pretty uniform in terms of through traffic on each route being quite similar, we'd reduce the amount of through bearers to just under the crossing. And this was all agreed and run past the RAM and also the STE team, and helped sort of come up with these solutions. So we were able to deliver all the S&C within our time frame.
So Bristol East Gantry caused us a lot of issues. So you can see the top photo, there's the existing that's sitting underneath the new main structure. When we got the design through at Grip 4 and me and Ben's team took on the project, we had a design for a gantry that didn't give gauge clearance, albeit the paperwork said it did. So when we ran clear underneath it, it showed that one, the structure wasn't clear from a clearance point of view, but also it didn't give OLE passive provision. So late in the day, we had to change the whole design of the gantry, which caused us a number of issues, especially because of the signal sighting that had already been agreed and the red aspect position. So we decided to go to the signal sighting committee and said, look, we're not going to change the red aspect position, but what we want to do is reconfigure all of the signaling equipment around that. So we moved the MARIs, the boards, and all of the telephone numbers and everything into a more streamlined solution that gave us the clearance that we needed, not only for just getting a train underneath it, but also for passive provision. This did cause us a late change and completely nearly derailed the program. So we had to make some serious agreements, and also we had issues with ground conditions. The plan was to do some sort of 10-meter piles, but when we augured out the material underneath, we found that the material was very soft red clay. So the foundation design changed at the late as well. So we had a few issues with the gantry, and that's to put it politely.
So cable management was a challenge. So the site's very constrained, as probably tell in terms of there's lots of S&C, so it reduces where we can take cables, but also going into the platforms, we're also restricted there. And as per the Network standards, we want to protect these cables specifically across track. So the Network Rail team worked sort of as the hub or integrator between all of our different contractors, and we sort of hosted design meetings to integrate where all these cable routes are going to be, which led to the production of a sort of cable cross-track cable schedule strategy sort of thing, which sort of identified where these cables were going to go, how they were going to get across tracks in terms of cable management sleepers or hollow bearers, what sort of how many cables we were expecting to go through those cable management sleepers, and if we had the right amount of capacity or if we needed to upgrade it. This was also very helpful in terms of where we had very tight areas. So on the right there, under the gantry, we've got sort of back-to-back S&C there. We've also got quite a lot of S&C equipment, so we were able to identify where these cable routes could be sort of positioned to ensure that they were protected, so the layout is sort of maintainable in the future, but also safe for people to walk around. Also, something that came out quite well shortly before the blockade was a new component that was recently been PAS approved, which was a hollow sleeper that can be installed in a check railed area. So especially going into the station, we had lots of very tight radii, which was all check railed. And at the time, we didn't have a way of getting cables across track in that location. But fortunately, a recent item's been released that's enables you to install a steel hollow in a check railed area. So if you haven't heard of it before, or one for the future.
Another bugbear of mine is signalling assets engaging. So we had a number of tight signs that needed to be installed. So on a 1970 interval, the speed signs that were part of the signalling scheme plan, where the size of them that we wanted to install just wouldn't fit. So we had to have bespoke speed signs made at a smaller head than is usual. This had to go through the signalling committee again for them to agree smaller heads to signposts. And again, we had issues with disc boxes that were installed too high. So during the blockade, there were a number of laser sweeps that were taken and clear route analysis run just to check that we wouldn't be foul when we installed any of the 4-foot signalling equipment.
So the platforms were a challenge as well, mainly because they're very old and they're not in brilliant condition, and also they're formed of lots of different construction types. With sort of over the years they've been extended, so this caused us issues, or has had caused us issues, especially in platform 13, where we found that the mortar was in very poor condition, and we had issues with attaching brackets for overhang issues. So we had to do a lot of testing, a lot of pull-out tests to ensure that we could attach these L plates. So as you can see from the photo, we did approximately 50 to 100 meters of cope adjustments, and we deemed it not a reasonable, or it was deemed not a reasonable opportunity to bring it into full compliance, which was agreed with the gauging engineer. So we moved all offsets towards compliance, and the same for crossfalls. And in terms of, and then also an added challenge was the station was also listed, so everything had to be replaced like for like, and copers that were in poor condition that needed to be replaced needed to be installed in the same as that was taken out. So we had to procure bespoke copers, which take a long time to procure. So just want to know for the future if you need to procure bespoke copers.
Right, and then one of the last struggles that we had to overcome was this limited area pinch point. So the photo to the left, you can see the left-handed track. There's a walkway that kind of that goes all the way down past that. So I needed to provide a walking route for access to the depot, but also house all of the signalling cables, and then there was an 11 kV electrical cable that needed to be installed as well. Now, due to the proximity of both of those, the electrical cable and the signalling cables needed to be 1 meter apart due to standards, and so we installed an elevated trough that housed the electrical components, and then a walkable walking route that housed all of the signalling cables underneath. That needed to work its way around a hand point. So we had to weave the troughing underneath the elevated posts, which was very difficult. And also we had to install a number of signs along this area as well. So this took us months to agree a solution with the RAM team to have an elevated trough with a bigger 11 kV cable in, but it was the only way that we were going to do it without buying land and trying to modify some of the underlying structures, which was never going to be a possibility with the timeframes that we had.
So the junction sat on quite a few underlying structures, as you can see from the diagram, which poses a number of challenges, both in terms of design but also construction. So from a construction perspective, we were limited with the size and type of plant we can use to undertake the work. So we worked very closely with the RAM team to understand the sort of limits we had for each structure, which is one of the reasons why we ended up using a number of Kirov 250s instead of larger Kirov cranes. From a design perspective, we had a lot of potential issues with ballast depths, and did have to submit a number of derogations for shallower ballast depths, and it also meant we put a number of mitigations in place, including using undersleeper pads and a variety of geotextiles to help with formation stiffness. To sort of identify these structures, we did take thorough TBI and structural trial pits to sort of identify depths and assist with producing cross sections and that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, we did come across a few issues while undertaking the works. So the number 4 bridge, which is the NMS goods depot, was a steel structure, and we found that it was actually shallower than we thought it would be. And we think, as you can see from the photos or the drawings, we think that our structural trial pits maybe didn't quite catch the high spots of the structure, potentially didn't hit the sort of mid-girder, main girder areas, and it meant that we were left with sort of 50 mil less ballast depth than we originally thought. So sort of, for me, lessons learned, trying to identify the sort of main components of the structure and highlighting where these high spots might be. But fortunately, we'd already put sort of mitigation in place with the undersleep pads and sort of geotextiles, so we didn't have to do anything further, and that was all agreed with the RAM team. We also used lessons learned from other projects. So Nine Elms, as you're probably aware, had issues with a parapet and sort of sidewall of a structure failing while construction work was taking place nearby. So we did a thorough review of all of our structures prior to the blockade, and we were able to identify one structure that had a parapet in quite poor condition, reasonably close to our works. So we worked closely with the RAM team, and they'd actually identified that structure for works in the future, and we were able to work with them and move their works forward to before the blockade using our access, and we're able to achieve some efficiencies there.
Okay, so moving on to some of the main achievements. So entry into service 6, which was the end of the blockade, was handed back on time with the full scope delivered for the whole project. To date, we've had no faults on the junction itself, so we're a couple of months on and still no faults. And the AMP16s were signed off for track within the blockade, but also so were the civils and EMP elements. We managed to reuse a number of the materials from the enabling stages at the Bristol East Junction in Kingston Road, but we also used them at the East Depot, which was a late scope change. At the depot itself, we applied the principles of speed and pace. And due to the temporary nature of the depot itself, it meant that we didn't need to go to any of the RAM team for any sort of sign-off, and the sign-off was undertaken by myself and the project engineers, which reduced the timescales to meet what the milestone was, which was pretty tight, as we only had 6 months to build a temporary depot. Some of the other achievements were we deviated from a number of standards, reducing the amount of scope, in particular at the platforms. So we didn't bring all of the platforms in Bristol Temple Meads into full compliance because it was deemed not a reasonable opportunity to do so. And due to the station being listed, this would have meant that nearly all of the station would have been rebuilt, which was just not allowed for in our cost plan. And then there was some good cross-industry collaboration, which meant that we could run as many services as possible and operate the junction without kind of closing the whole station, with the exception of the 11 days when we needed to do some of the data changes and the signalling changes. So for the whole of the 8-week blockade, we only actually meant that we closed the station for 11 days, so that wasn't bad. Are there any questions?
So fantastic, absolutely excellent. There are a huge amount of questions here. Let me jump back. Really good. Get to start. I think. Let's see. I think the first one was actually from myself. That must be the role of the chairman to be able to jump in there first. So I suppose I was thinking about if there was a drive to provide more kind of standard and simplified layouts, standard designs or anything. I'm not too sure what was in there before. I'm sure there was some really pretty interesting, horrible transition units that you just can't get anymore. Was that one of the drivers at all, for that new layout?
So the driver was that the junction was life expired. That was the main driver, and that opportunity meant that we were able to standardise the layout using as many basically crossovers and turnouts that were on a straight as possible. Now, due to the tight curvature into the station, there are a number of bespoke S&C units, but all in all, we didn't deviate from many of the REPW drawings, did we? There was one turnout that was 2-leveled, that basically was the connection between the 4 lines and the 2 lines from Bath. But apart from that, I think we managed to get everything in with normal S&C units.
Okay. So you'll have a very happy track maintenance engineer there by the sound of things.
I mean, yeah, they're over the moon because they were going out and maintaining that quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely, I'm sure. We have a question from Jim Watson, and he's following on from my own question about reduction in point ends. He was asking if the 50 down to 50 reduction, if there was any sort of effect on operational flexibility, in particular in times of kind of perturbation or anything. Was that a concern or a consideration?
It wasn't a concern, actually. The rationalisation of the S&C actually meant that the operating model of how the station works was better. So what we were doing was segregating fast services into the platforms that needed to be through roads, and then the slow ones as stoppers. So actually our ops colleagues are kind of happier with the layout as it is now. But it did go through, years of workshops and buy-in from ASLEF and all the talks to sign up to it. So it wasn't an easy task, but we got there in the end.
Sure, thank you, Molly. The next question, another from myself, and I think you probably answered that. I was asking about does Bristol East sit on top of arch structures, etc., and were these problematic? So from the kind of the cameras, you could see it was sitting, higher up in it. I think as you probably covered much of them. Was it a mixture of kind of steel deck and arch, or a bit of both? Or
Yeah, it was, to be honest, half, like the top half of the junction, so the Filton sides was predominantly arch structures, and then the lower
okay,
half was a flat steel deck. So I think over time, where they've expanded the junction, they've used different technique. So there was sort of differences in bar steps. So we had quite detailed structural trial pits go out and try and identify where we have a change between the structures, ensuring that we're keeping quite consistent back steps. So other than what I mentioned earlier in terms of that slightly shallower deck, generally we achieved the back depths that we were planning to achieve.
sure. And I think you mentioned about the Kiro cranes. You were using a smaller one, which sounds familiar. Was that generally on the steel decks were causing the issue with load, or was it on all structures? Or
I think it was pretty blanket in that we used the 250 Kirovs in basically over there, because there's just outside the station we had a run of quite a few underlying structures. So
yeah,
sort of where they were. Unfortunately, over the Gantry we didn't have any structures, so we were able to use the slightly larger Kirovs.
brilliant. Thank you. I have a question from Mark Taylor, our section secretary, and a comment about a huge amount of this work and probably disruption that goes along with it. And he was just asking how the Tox and Fox felt about it. I'm sure there was a kind of before, during, and after kind of feeling. Was that you spoke a little bit earlier there about the kind of years of negotiation, which sounds quite painful, but was there issues at the time in that, or are they now on that kind of we're glad we've got over the hill type of scenario?
I mean, I would never want to throw our sponsors under the bus, but our talks got everything they wanted, so I hope they're happy now. It was they were working up to giving the access for years, and it was a kind of once in a lifetime kind of access opportunity to close Bristol Temple Meads from London. So what we tried to do is fit in as much as possible. So that's why the roof and the eastern entrance were in our access, and we managed to do a lot more than what was originally planned. Now we're moving on to the west side of the junction, which is less complicated in the future, and the operators are not going to have a bigger say in that. So that's going to be like for like and not rationalised to give them everything they want. So that they should be happy, but I think they're probably more angry now because we've got the rest of the junction to do.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you. There was a little question from myself about the drone footage. So I found that really helpful. I've saw the time lapse stuff kind of before, and that's really good as well. But the drone footage on a project of this scale gives you a real sense of how everything sits and comes together. Is that something you've used before, or is it something you're going to new or something you're going to use again in the future? Did you find that was an advantage to the project?
It was. I wish we did it earlier, if I'm honest. The drone footage would have been brilliant during detailed design, but we only managed to get it done after the enabling stages were installed. And that was just trying to find a contract that we could get through procurement that was set up, and the rigmarole of Network Rail processes. But once we got there, it was so useful, and I would say for just presenting but also explaining the junction, but seeing the assets and everything, we will definitely be taking that forward for some of our other enhancement jobs.
Perfect. Thanks, Molly. We have a question from Jim Watson, a good old PWI question. Was there any drainage installed or the existing drainage refurbished as part of the works? So how did we get on with drainage? Was
there was no drainage, and I am so thankful there was no drainage. So it's all naturally drained through the underlying structures that have got weep holes that go into the River Avon underneath. I mentioned Filton tracking, which is where Bristol kind of East Junction ties into Filton. We installed 12 kilometres of drainage on that track, and that was the biggest challenge that we had to overcome, and still has legacy problems now because the amount of drainage we installed. So yeah, thankfully no drainage for Bristol East, and I don't know if we'd be sitting here today if there was.
Okay, thank you. A quick question from Martin Batty and the modular S&C, and I think we've probably covered that, and you talked us through the Modular Plus system and the kind of rationale behind where it was used and everything. So hopefully, Martin, we've got an answer to that one. Another quick question about one for myself about the scale of projects. So I was asking about this is a huge project on its own, and do you feel that delivering it as albeit in stages and everything, but one big single package is a better way to deliver it from a kind of effectiveness and efficiency, I suppose, point of view, rather than coming in and doing sort of small chunks every couple of years? How did you feel from that point of view?
It's a difficult one to answer. Yes, I think doing it under the umbrella of one project is easier. You only have to set up contracts once, and you only have to appoint designers, DPEs, whatever, CREs, and you build the relationship like that. Do I think that the Blockade itself, we shouldn't have tried to keep passenger services running? It made it so complicated. There were 6 entry service points. There were 6 signalling stage scheme plans. There were 4 Form Bs just for the Blockade, and we had multiple amount of design packages for the enabling stages itself. It caused real confusion, and there was an overrun halfway through the block because we were doing modification to lokes for one entry into service package, and then coming back and modifying those lokes again for subsequent entry into service points, and it was confusing. And if we could have just closed the station, which I know nobody wants to hear, we could have done it quicker with much more efficiencies. And during the COVID times, which obviously we couldn't have foreseen 5-10 years ago, it would have been a better solution. We would have closed the station for maybe 3-4 weeks and just done it in one big bang, and that would have been better for us.
Sure. I did notice a little COVID test kit on one of your slides, subtly in the corner type of thing, and just to remind us that you were all trying to balance that at the same time as COVID was around and everything, which is a pretty tricky situation just on its own, doing domestic stuff, never mind something this
Yeah, and what was really strange was we let the GRIP 5 contracts to the main contractors, so AMCO, Alstom and SRSA, basically in the first week of the first lockdown. So I was in charge of integrating all of those spokes together, and didn't really meet a lot of those people until kind of halfway through the detailed design, which was a pain. And I think if we were in a normal world of no COVID, we would have all been sitting in the same office. It would have made collaboration better, and it wouldn't have been so segregated, which was difficult at times.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. We have a question from Jim Watson, and Jim was asking about HPSS, the use of HPSS rather than high drive, if that was a kind of local or indeed a kind of route preference. Was there any on the point operating?
It's a route preference from the RAM, the signalling RAM down here. I think there are benefits with remote condition monitoring, but also in Western-super-Mare is where the HPSS are manufactured, so they're local, and they definitely want HPSS to be rolled out across the board in the Western region.
Sure, yeah. So it's kind of consistent throughout. Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, a few more questions. It's a classic question. If you were to do one thing differently, what would it be? So if you went through it, I suppose, have you got anything, Ben, yourself, that if you were to go through this again, you would do differently? Just the one thing, remember. I'm sure you got a list.
I think from talking cable management, which I guess isn't track, but anyway, I think Alstom plan to try and reuse as many cables as possible to save money, but it just caused us so many issues with working out what sort of troughing capacities we were going to have, and fitting and trying to work that out prior to the blockade. And I would say we still, going into the blockade, we still weren't 100% sure if we had sufficient troughing, because we weren't sure what cables were coming or going. So I think trying to get a clearer steer on that would have made the generation of sort of the cable management strategy a little bit easier, I'd say.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a good one. And how about yourself, Molly? Any one specific that, if you had the magic wand?
Oh, it would be the Blockade, one big bang, close the station.
Yeah. Okay. That's a big magic wand required for that one, isn't it? Brilliant one, though. Good, good. On that kind of subject of hollow sleepers and everything, Tom Wilson's got a quick question about asking about the hollow steel sleeper with the check tail base plate, and indeed he was asking about the background if it was if it was product accepted, or if it was had to be accelerated, or to suit the project. You know, how you
It was
the product
just going from a trial certificate into a proper PADS approved certificate. So it was done beforehand. The project didn't accelerate it. There were 3 other PADS approvals that were accelerated. One was to do with points, heating, transformers. We had something to do with signalling. Can't remember the last one, but there were 3 things that were driven by the project to get PADS approval, but that wasn't one of them.
Sure, perfect. Okay. Another question from Jim Watson about future proofing for electrification, and we spoke quite a bit about the gantry, etc., as well, type of thing. And Jim was asking about if, in particular for foundations, if there was any pinch points identified. Was that within the kind of scope, thinking about where future overhead lines go?
The Grip 3 design, which didn't actually materialise to what it looks like today, they ran in parallel an OLE design and the track design. And then electrification was deferred from this area because it was too difficult. So the Grip 3 design stayed as it is, but the Grip 5 design matured. So there is no kind of scope for foundations. They would have to use what we've done and then kind of work around it. And the only thing that was passive provision under the gantry, but that doesn't allow for where the wires are or any of the small OLE assets that would be part of any of those stanchions. So the signal sighting is going to be a nightmare, and I know that the sponsors are now kind of asking for a remit to start looking at if it's even possible.
Okay, yeah. So it's on the horizon, at least anyway. The consideration. Brilliant. A question about buffer stops and overrun risk zones. One of our colleagues is saying about it looks fairly challenging. Were there issues trying to gain compliance with buffer stop overruns, or anything in particular? Or?
No, so we had a 20-metre buffer overrun zone for the permanent ones. We during the blockade had to install temporary buffer stops on tight radius curves, and we had bespoke buffers made for that because they weren't on straights and stuff like that. So we worked quite a lot with Rory for those, but actually the overruns were allowed for in the design.
I think I remember that in another job doing buffer stops and tight curves and everything, and it's quite challenging. Well, it's not quite as simple as you think, I suppose. Perfect. A little question from Tom Wilson about ballast steps on bridges, which obviously had a bit of a challenge with. And Tom was asking if there was ever any consideration of using steel sleepers as a solution because of the reduced kind of ballast depth requirement. Was that ever considered, or was it always a traditional method?
An answer?
It was never considered, I don't believe. Well, since I joined the project, it wasn't considered, but I think it was always identified from early on, so it never came through sort of the RRD that they wanted steels. But from the amount of S&C we had in close proximity, I don't think it'd been able to fit in anyway.
Sure, no problem. Okay, thank you, Ben. A question from Metal Mickey, who's a metallurgist, so he was just asking about rail grades. If there was what grades were used, i.e. if there was anything of any high performance rail grades or anything, or and indeed the lubrication that runs with that, if there's a lubrication strategy, if that was part of the exercise. Or...
Yeah, so we didn't use any high performance rail for any of the switches. All of the crossings were explosive or EDH. In terms of lubrication, we had a strategy which we liaised with the SCE team to identify specifically where we had high risk switches to make sure that we were providing sufficient lubrication, and then worked with manufacturers as well to help us sort of come up with the strategy.
And then we also installed railhead friction modifiers as well in certain locations that were going to help with where the high wear switches were installed. So there was a big lubrication and railhead friction modifier strategy that you worked closely with the RAM and the central team to kind of agree.
Yeah, I can imagine it was a monster. Yeah, brilliant. Another quick question, Tom Wilson. Was the RSSB approach before it was decided that the project change was not considered a reasonable opportunity to achieve compliance with RGS and the NTSNs?
So no, they weren't. So we were very clear from the outset that it wasn't a reasonable opportunity, and did a compliance report that basically identified all of the non-compliances in terms of XYs, lighting, CCTV, crossfalls, recess, etc. There was a scheme developed that basically said this is what it would look like and this is how much it was going to cost. So all of that went into the compliance report that basically said it's not a reasonable opportunity. Also, there's this kind of draft note that's been knocking around in the Western region in particular, I don't know if it's nationally, that says, you know, if you're doing modifications to a platform that's less than 30%, then it's not an alteration as defined, it's not a substantial lengthening or rebuilding of the platform, and therefore you don't have to comply with complete XY values, but what you have to do is move towards compliance, and that's what we did. Everywhere where we moved the track or we moved the copers, we moved towards compliance, and this was kind of agreed at RAM level, at national gauging levels. It went through our internal processes, and also this project is interoperable and it is significant. So I had to take that thought process through our appointed body, and NCB basically agreed that it wasn't a reasonable opportunity, and that's as far as it went.
Sure, excellent. Thanks, Molly. The next one is as much a comment from our section secretary Mark Taylor, saying an impressive amount of work within the timescales. Well done, all involved. So another feather in your cap, and I certainly endorse that myself. Bob Gardner, again, commend you on an excellent presentation on a hugely challenging project with loads of potential pitfalls, and very well done. I hope you enjoy similar success in the future work, including Metro West as well. So encouraging comments from Bob as well. And finally, I think one from Tom Wilson. He says, you mentioned Everrail standards derogation without RE track endorsement. Does that still require tracker input? So I presume it would do, yeah, or I'll let you guys answer.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, full completion of the trackers and input to the system for their sign off.
Sure. So there's still visibility and a record of the process and everything like that. Then fantastic. You could always rely on Tom asking a difficult question at the very end. You couldn't be, you know.
Thanks, Tom.
Nice one, Tom. Excellent. That's all the questions that were in the chat box. What I was going to do, if I can manage to do this myself, is, or indeed, you may be able to unmute. If there's any questions from the floor, I'll try and unmute all. This is probably ending tears, so if you've got any barking dogs in the background, please give them a bone just now. If this will work. I think what you is I've unmuted everyone. I think if you wish to ask a question, just press your in fact, Tom's managed to do it yet. Press your button. So and ask away, please. You should be able to unmute yourself if you want to. Tom, did you have any other questions or passing comments at all?
No, I was just going to say that you expect nothing less from me than an awkward question to finish on. That was all. And this is just to test the unmuting, Russell. So I know that unmute all is sometimes a bit of an issue, but maybe somebody else can unmute and just call for allow their dog to bark. Maybe a Jim Watson could say something.
Absolutely, yeah. My dog's very quiet just now, thankfully. So, but Jim, how are you doing?
Apologies,
Fine.
I've got to go. So thank you for everybody. I've got to run, and we'll answer any more
You're a
questions.
star. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks for doing this at short notice as well. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Anyway, Russell, I'm sorry, I don't have a dog that can bark in the background, but I would like to take the opportunity to actually thank Molly and Ben for their excellent presentation tonight. I certainly thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would wholeheartedly agree with Molly's sentiments on going for the big bang rather than having a multi-stage project. Yet stop all the trains running, and then you can tackle the elephant in the room, which of course is signalling data changes, which are time consuming and terribly expensive. But thank you, Molly. Thank you, Ben. Thoroughly enjoyed your presentation tonight.
Oh yes, absolutely second that. Yeah.
An observation from me, Russell.
Yes, please, Tom.
Yep. And I know it was said, Molly asked if it was just a kind of Western region thing. The issue about length of platform, 30%, are we doing? It's nothing to do with percentages. It's all about arguing the reasonable opportunity or not. So when and just as a little plug, the Infrastructure Standards Committee, they meet every other month, but they now have a drop-in centre meeting. So prospective applicants, somebody that might be thinking they need a deviation from an infrastructure standard, they can come along to that on a very informal basis, sound out the committee members who are at the drop-in centre, and it's like a very relaxed surgery. You won't get a decision at that meeting, but it allows you to air your views, discuss what data or what backup, what mitigation measures you might need for a deviation application to be granted. Okay. And it's something that means you don't have to go to the full process of preparing a big presentation for your deviation application on the day of the race. This is something you can sound out the committee beforehand. But be aware that percentage of length of platform is not in itself a reason to avoid, for example, platform heights and offsets.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. Thanks, Tom. Bob, I see you're unmuted. Did you have anything you wanted to add at all, or that? Or?
Yeah, just reiterate the excellent presentation on the modular S&C subject. Obviously, having been out of thing for a long time, this issue about risk of separation or gauge spread, is this going to lead to retro work on existing situations? And I guess that depends on the monitoring that's no doubt going on. But what's the official position on modular S&C that's been in the ground now for 20 years?
I think, Ben, I don't know if you've got any experience of that, Ben, or anyone else in the room wants to add on?
No, I don't personally.
Yeah, I know that I recall that our presentation a couple of months back, the sleeve, the steel shroud, that joins both together, there was a kind of design change that was kind of imminent, I think, at the time, and they were going to try and tighten up the tolerances and indeed change the fixing. So I think traditionally it was just a kind of steel shroud, and the chair screws were driven into the top of the concrete itself. And I think there was going to be a little change to that, but was that, you might know if it was just kind of standard traditional shrouds, maybe, Ben, I'm not too sure if there was anything, you know, new or bespoke about the shrouds. I think they're still to come in rather than, you know, they've been down. But
I mean, going forward, Russell, for us, I mean, anything that we're doing is going to be modular up in Scotland, and I think it's all to do with the shrouds. I think it's the installation of the shrouds, what tools they've been using, and you know how that's being monitored. Because I think that is where the sort of main concern comes in. Because you can't just go in there with a sort of a balance, you know, and screw these things down. You've got to have the proper sort of torque gun and the settings and all the rest of it. But you've also got to make sure that your formation is as flat as you can possibly get it. Because if you've got any sort of, you know, variation in height, then you're effectively using that screw that goes into the shroud to lift that part of that concrete split bearer into position. And I think that's where you're putting unnecessary tension and force and stresses into the split bearer system.
Sure. And
can I possibly jump in here, Russell?
Please,
Mark certainly raised a very, very valid issue there about construction, and I would, coming from a construction background, I would very much agree with them that one of the big issues that we had with a modular S&C installation was getting a properly compacted level ballast bed. The worst possible situation you could have, and I've seen it myself, is that when you're putting your second road down, you're sitting slightly higher than the road that's already in. And when you put these screws down in the shroud, you're actually trying to lift not the new bit of track, but the track that's already in there.
Correct.
So it's all down to construction and control of that bottom ballast on site.
And of course,
Absolutely,
the issue there, Jim, is getting the compaction across that width. Because if you're using triple whacker or even a roller, you've only got the width of that roller that's consolidating that little footprint in the sand or in the fluffy ballast. That is, you know, you're not getting that full width. And when you've got when you're going over the full width, it's difficult to get that homogeneous level. And then even when you do, you put part of it down, and then you're putting another pit down that's maybe had a machine over the top of it since.
Yep, and of course the other risk you've got, or not so much a risk, I think it's a fear from the operators on site of your whacker plate, is getting close enough to that existing part of the modular bearer that's already been installed. You're going to leave this little ridge that's sitting high and isn't as consolidated as the surrounding ballast.
Exactly. If you're installing modular bearers in a bowling green, your bowling green will accommodate them. But when you try and do it in the dark of a Saturday night in the wind and rain over that kind of distance and install the job in two halves, it's always going to be difficult to get that level playing field.
Sure. And I did like,
just say that for Ben, it was very helpful to see the diagrams and the reasoning for the long bearers and how you situated them. And that got the job in safe, sound for your purposes. When they have to be renewed in 50 years' time, none of us will be worried about it, I don't expect, but it will be a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did like, so there was a consideration about the different traffic patterns as they stand just now anyway, to try and see if there was big differentials between one route or the other. So that was helpful to see that as well. So that's good. Most of the issues I've found with the modulars were the single leg. You know, there's a join in the forefront. It's a single leg, surely short bearer, and the alignment of that in particular as well. But again, I absolutely back the rationale about making sure that you just take time and getting that ballast correct and getting the preparation done, consolidation and line and level and everything like that. So yeah, perfect. Any other quick comments from the floor at all, or questions before we wrap up?
I'm sorry to hog the floor here, Russell, but can I throw one to Ben about one of my pet topics after any big project? Yeah, you go through a lessons learned session, so the project manager puts a wee tick in his project management tick box. has, in this case, anything been done to ensure that the lessons learned, and I'm sure there's some really valuable lessons learned from this project, are cascaded on to other projects, not just in the route, but nationally?
Yeah, so there's already been a number of lessons learned with all the contractors, and we've already been contacted by a number of projects around the country. So hopefully it's going to be all properly written up and pushed out to everybody. And I'm sure getting in touch with the project and the project or project managers, they'll be happy to sort of set up meetings to if you've got any questions or anything like that. So yeah, hopefully it will be all properly sent out.
Excellent, thanks, Ben. And to be fair, you know, forums like tonight where you've shared what you've done, how you've done it, and the issues and everything, it goes a long way into sharing that information for the people that are here, and indeed the people in the future that will be watching this in weeks, months, or years' time on YouTube. You know, just getting a background on where that is. I suppose one of the key things, and Jim, you once gave us, I remember, a fantastic example of all the ugly parts of the project that really went bad, you know, and that's the thing that is the key thing, is not to be shy and saying, well, we've done this great stuff as well, but there was the horrible stuff that we would never ever do again, you know, it just went completely wrong. And it's sometimes painful to go through that process again, but it means that, you know, hopefully the next time round and the next time round again, that other projects don't fall into these pitfalls. So try to be brave and let everyone know exactly what the good stuff and the bad as well, I suppose.
And indeed, Russell, yeah, it's rather ironic that the presentation you're talking about wasn't a million miles away from Bristol. It was Swindon to Kemble. Yeah, the big thing is to discover the pitfalls. You can dig a bear trap and fall in it once, but if you fall in it a second or third time, there's no excuse.
Yeah. Sometimes there's that many people in the first place, you don't get a chance to fall in though, Jim, you know, so.
It's always bad you fall in your own bear trap, isn't it? Always a bit embarrassing.
Certainly is.
Yeah, we've all been there, yeah. Brilliant. I'm going to suggest, unless there's any other burning questions or comments on the floor, it doesn't look like it. I'm going to just quickly run through. It's a shame Molly's not here to hear as well, but run through the meeting. Absolutely fantastic presentation, Ben. And you know, the scale of the thing, this entire project was huge. However, you managed still to drill down into the detail of individual elements, and that's really fantastic. And I think is a key part of the success. You spoke about, you know, the next steps, the next projects you are doing personally, and you'll share that experience you've learned yourself into these next projects. And just that, you know, when looking at the drone footage and you know the 7-track wide railway type of thing. To be fair, I've been to Bristol a few times and everything. I could not imagine, you know, it was on that kind of scale if someone had asked me before. So that was really valuable. I mean, the project was so diverse. You even kind of built a train depot. You know what I mean? Just as part of the works. You know, that gives you the kind of scale of things. And that the multidisciplinary thing, you know, how you involve all the different elements and that, the interfaces are so complicated, and it's just that, you know, it's a logistical management element on its own. Throw in CDM on top of that type of thing, so you've got multiple different parties working and responsibilities, and then you've got the operational people, you know, working with trains running, everything. Really a big thing to manage. So well done in that. I was going to ask you about the shopping list, you know, to say, give me some exciting figures, you know, and you gave us that slide, and that alone, so it was 300 odd S&C units or 250 S&C units, but that was just for one slice of the pie type of thing, you know, in the panels you were talking about, and the amount of welds, etc. there. So and that was just one of the big blockades. So when you think about, you know, just the logistics of each of these huge scales of components, absolutely immense. I mean, so really impressive. The gauging part in the signal gantry, yep, absolutely. I think we've had some similar kind of experience of that, not on that scale, unfortunately, and trying to get that solution. So when you involve signal and sighting committees, no matter what it is, you know what I mean. trying to get them to agree is, as you say, months, not weeks or days or anything like that. So well done getting your head round that for the team. And as you said at the end, I think the lessons learned is a key part of that. And you do all your best intentions, digging trial pits and thinking you've got stuff, but getting that little bit of extra knowledge that you kind of worked out well. There could be high spots on structures. Knowing that for the next time around is really, really valuable. So excellent work. And finally, I think the final slides looking at handed back on time, no faults, and how you ever managed to get the AMP16. Brilliant, well done getting the AMP16 sign off. I'm sure though the maintenance guys were over the moon, so they were happy to see the. So that's brilliant, because some of the best projects in the world, that final element, the final sign off of just drags on and on. So really brilliant. You've kept that momentum up right throughout the project, and all the best for the future projects coming on, which I'm sure are going to be a total success with a similar team, delivering that. So well done. So if I could ask our members to unmute their mics if they can, please. And I'm going to ask the members just to show their appreciation in the normal manner. So well done. Brilliant, Ben. Thank you. And well done to Molly as well. She can watch the recording when it comes on in a few weeks' time or something on the YouTube channel.
I'll pass on your kind words to her. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to stop the record thing just a second. Stop the record.